ever seen butterflies sitting on beautiful flowers? You might have seen some other insects sitting on flowers. These are one of the beautiful gifts given by nature to us, isn't it? Let me ask you a question here. Why do insects visit flowers? Are insects just attracted to the colored petals of the flowers? Or do they do it to obtain something? You might be thinking about nectar here, right? So, insects visit flowers to obtain nectar. But then, why do plants produce nectar? Isn't it an energy-consuming process? So, there might be some reason that plants produce nectar in flowers to attract insects, right? But what is it? The answer is pollination. Pollination is the process by which the pollen grains from anther are transferred to the stigma. Let us discuss the process of pollination, its types and agents in detail. So, let's begin the educational journey. Recall a few concepts before discussing pollination. You already know that reproduction in flowering plants is grouped into three major events, which are pre-fertilization, fertilization and post-fertilization. You have already learned about the process of formation of male and female gametes in flowering plants in the last video, right? The non-motile male and female gametes produced in pollen grain and embryo sac respectively should come in contact with each other to facilitate the process of fertilization. To bring these non-motile male and female gametes of the flowering plants together, the process of pollination occurs. Well, does pollination transfer the pollen grains from the anther to the stigma of the same flowers only? Or the pollen grains from the anther of a flower produced on a different plant can be carried to the stigma of a flower? The answer lies in the type of pollination based on the sources of pollen grains. Let us discuss. Pollination is categorized as autogamy, geitonogamy and xenogamy. As the name suggests, autogamy is the pollination within the same flower. So, pollen grains from the anther are carried to the stigma of the same flower in autogamy. Autogamy occurs when pollen grains are released at the same time as the stigma becomes mature and receptive. This is because the release of pollen grains before or after the stigma receptivity will not allow the germination of pollen grains that occurs after pollination. Another condition for autogamy is close contact between the anther and the stigma of the flower. You might ask a question here. Is it possible for a stigma of an open flower to receive pollen grains from the same flower while discarding the pollen grains from the other flowers of the same plant or different plants? You are correct. Complete autogamy for open flowers is quite impossible, since pollen grains from other flowers of the same plant or different plants of the same species can fall on a receptive stigma. Let me tell you an interesting adaptation in flowers to achieve complete autogamy. Some plants produce two types of flowers called cleistogamous and chasmogamous flowers. Cleistogamous flowers are the ones that do not open and remain closed even at maturity. So, the anther and the stigma of these closed flowers lies close to each other to facilitate autogamy and are not exposed to prevent the landing of undesirable pollen grains. Can you tell me some benefits of cleistogamy? The production of cleistogamous flowers maintains the adaptive genetic features present in the maternal plant and produce seed set without any dependence on pollinators. So, the production of cleistogamous flowers is an energy-efficient process as these flowers produce seeds despite the formation of less number of pollen grains. You might ask a question here. If the production of cleistogamous flowers is such a beneficial process, why do all flowering plants do not produce cleistogamous flowers? Why do they produce open flowers called chasmogamous flowers? The answer is the flowers that opens at maturity are called chasmogamous flowers. The exposed anther and stigma of these flowers prevent complete autogamy and facilitate pollination of stigma with pollen grains from other flowers of the same plant or different plants. So, chasmogamous flowers facilitate the mixing of genetic information from two different plants if the pollen grains come from a different flower. This mixing maintains the genetic variations in the plant, which in turn is required for evolution. We'll not discuss evolution in detail here. However, you should know that the presence of genetic variation is required for maintaining the species on Earth. So, some plants such as sunflowers, orchids and garden pea produce only chasmogamous flowers, while others such as oxalis, commelina and viola produce cleistogamous and chasmogamous flowers to derive the benefits of autogamy while maintaining the genetic variations. Let me ask you a question here. If the pollen grains from the anther of a flower lands on a stigma of a separate flower of the same plant, is it autogamy? When the pollen grains from the anther of a flower are transferred to the stigma of another flower born on the same plant, it is called geitonogamy. Since both the flowers are present on the same plant and all the cells of a plant are derived from the same zygote and carry the same genes, geitonogamy is genetically autogamy. However, the pollen grains are carried to the stigma of another flower by an agent of pollination. So, it is cross-pollination or xenogamy functionally. Now, what do the term agents of pollination or cross-pollination or xenogamy mean here? Let us discuss them one by one. So, let's discuss cross-pollination first. Cross-pollination is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a flower to the stigma of another flower present on a different plant of the same species. It is also called xenogamy and involves pollination agents. As already mentioned, cross-pollination imparts genetic variations by mixing the genetic material of two plants. Now, what is an agent of pollination? What is its role in pollination? An agent of pollination is any living or non-living factor that carries the pollen grain from one flower to another flower. Animals are living or biotic agents of pollination, while wind and water are non-living or abiotic agents of pollination. You might ask a question here, how do wind and water serve as an agent of pollination? And what about animals? How do animals facilitate pollination? Flowering plants such as grasses, ragweeds, maples and oaks depend on wind for pollination. These plants exhibit some adaptation to facilitate pollination by wind. Few of the adaptations are they produce many small inconspicuous flowers rather than producing large and colorful petals. Their flowers lack scent or nectar. Some of them have large feathery stigmas that trap wind-borne pollen grains. Since a wind pollination is a chance event and the probability of a pollen grain landing on a stigma of the same species of flower is less. The wind-pollinated plants produce large quantities of pollen grains to ensure that some pollen grain will land on the appropriate stigma. Pollination by water is mostly not exhibited by flowering plants and is confined to monocotyledons, while algae, Bryophytes and pteridophytes mainly depends on water for the transport of their male gametes. Examples of flowering plants that depends on water for pollination are freshwater plants such as Vallisneria and Hydrilla, and marine sea grasses such as Zostera. These plants also have some features to facilitate pollination by water. Let's see that features. The plants pollinated by water lack nectar and scent as they do not need living pollinating agents such as insects to visit them for pollination. Another adaptive feature of these plants is the presence of a mucilaginous sheet around the pollen grains to protect them from the water. The female flowers of sea grasses such as Zostera remain submerged in the water and their stigma receive the long ribbon-like pollen grain released from the male flower inside the water. On the other hand, the female flowers of Vallisneria have a long stalk and grow to the surface level of water to receive the pollen grains or male flowers transported by the passive water current from the male inflorescence. Here, Vallisneria produces male and female flowers on separate plants, and the male flowers have small stalks. Now, are all aquatic flowering plants are pollinated by water? Are there any aquatic flowering plants pollinated by wind or insects or any other pollinating agent than water? The answer is yes. Water hyacinth and water lilies produce flowers that grow above the surface of water. Their flowers are pollinated by insects or wind. Animals that mediate pollination are birds, butterflies, flies, bees, wasps, bats, and ants. Lemurs, some reptiles such as garden lizards and rodents also serves as pollinating agents of some plants. Irrespective of the type of the animals, these plants produce flowers with various features to attract the respective pollinating agents. Let's see the features. They produce visually attractive petals and scents. Some flowers have a sugary substance called nectar, which is an energy-rich food produced to attract the pollinating agents. Protein-rich pollen grains are also food for some animals which then pollinate the flowers. Pollinating agents move from flowers to flowers for food and carry the pollens on their body surface to facilitate pollination in the plants. Around 70% of flowering plants are pollinated by insects and bees, which are the main pollinators of crop plants. Can you tell me some specific features of insect-pollinated flowers? Insect-pollinated flowers mostly have violet, blue or yellow petals, as these colors are easily seen by the insects. Example, yellow or orange flowers of safflowers, which can be easily seen by insects. Since insects have a well-developed sense of smell, the insects' pollinated flowers produce a strong scent that is not necessarily pleasant for humans. For instance, the carrion flower pollinated by flies produces a smell like rotting meat in which these flies lay their eggs. So, the flies visit these flowers to find a place for laying eggs, and in the process, they transfer the pollen grains. However, these flies do not lay eggs on carrion flowers, as the larvae would starve to death. Likewise, the tallest flowers of Amorphophallus produce a foul smell to attract the flies, which then visit the flowers to lay their eggs, and in this process, they facilitate pollination. The pronoba moth pollinates yucca flowers. Moth visits the flowers to lay its egg in the locule of the ovary, and the pollen grains become deposits on its body surface. As the pollen-laden moth visits another yucca flower, pollination occurs. Here, the hatching of the egg to release larva and the production of seed by pollinated yucca flowers occurs at the same time. Let me tell you an interesting fact here. Apart from insects, bats also serve as pollinators. But bats are nocturnal and they do not see well during daytime. So, how are they attracted to a flower such as that of Mucama holtoni to pollinate it? Bats' pollinated flowers open at night, mostly have dull white petals and produce a strong scent to attract the bats. Now that you have learned about the different categories of pollination and some important pollinating agents, can you tell if autogamy or self-pollination or xenogamy or cross-pollination is advantageous for plants, or if both have their specific benefits? Irrespective of maintaining the existing adaptive genetic traits, the continuous autonomy in hermaphrodite plants causes accumulation of the harmful genetic features in the progeny. It is also called inbreeding depression. On the other hand, cross-pollination is energy-expensive process as it includes agents of pollination. However, it also includes a fusion of gametes from two different parents which impart the variations to the progeny, and this variation may increase the survival under certain environmental conditions. So, are there some strategies exhibited by plants to prevent autogamy and facilitate cross-pollination? Let's find out. Since all the following strategies prevent self-pollination and facilitate cross-pollination, they are called outbreeding devices. Production of either staminate or male flowers, the flowers with stamens but no carpels, or carpellate flowers, the flowers with carpels but no stamens. It prevents the chance of self-pollination. Here, monoecious plants such as castor and maize produce the staminate and carpellate flowers on the same plant that does not allow autogamy but cannot prevent geitonogamy. On the other hand, dioecious plants such as papaya have male and female flower on separate plants to prevent both autogamy and geitonogamy. The hermaphrodite flowers with both stigma and carpels release pollen grains before or after the time that the stigma of that flower becomes receptive. Some hermaphrodite flowers have stamens and carpels positioned in a way that the pollen grains do not land on the stigma of the same flower. Another strategy is the ability of a flower to identify and reject its pollen grains to prevent them from pollinating the same flower or other flowers on the same plant. It is regulated by genes and are called self-incompatibility. Here, the pollen grains do not germinate and the pollen tube does not grow on the stigma of the same flower or other flowers of the same plant. It ensures that pollination occurs only when pollen grains are from a genetically different plant. Now that you have learned about pollination in detail, can you tell if all the pollens that land on a stigma germinates to facilitate the process of fertilization? If yes, what if a pollen lands on the stigma of a flower of a different species? You know that sexual reproduction occurs between organisms of the same species, right? So how do plants identify that particular pollen fallen on the stigma of its flower belong to the same or different species? The answer is pollen pistil interaction. We'll learn about the pollen pistil interaction in our next session. Let's now summarize what we have learned.
Manorama Horizon. Learning made simple.